Comrades, hear me now. The world you inhabit is not an accident of nature, nor is the life you live a mere reflection of your own choices. It is a construct, a meticulously designed machine built to extract, consume, and squander the most precious commodity you possess, your time. Every hour you labor, every moment you surrender to meaningless toil, is harvested by a system that calls itself civilization but functions as nothing more than the organized theft of your life. Time, comrades, is not just a measurement of hours. It is the essence of your existence. The system does not merely demand your labor, it demands your mind, your attention, your very vitality. From the moment you awaken to the first breath you take, the machinery of capitalism is already at work, extracting from you value that is neither returned nor acknowledged. You work not for your own flourishing, but for the accumulation of wealth in the hands of those who will never feel the sting of your exhaustion, never know the weight of your struggle. Consider the factory, the office, the gig economy, the arenas where your hours are spent. Every day, you are sold illusions of progress while the real wealth, produced by your hands and your intellect, is siphoned upward. The profits of your labor are not your own. They are the property of the capitalist, the overseer, the absentee owner who sits safely above the grinding gears of industry while you bleed time as if it were nothing. And you are told to be grateful, to accept this theft as the natural order of things, to call it life or necessity. But necessity is not a law. It is a doctrine enforced by power. The bourgeoisie survives by keeping you blind to the true value of your existence. They teach you to measure life not by freedom or creativity or solidarity, but by wages, status, and consumption. They pit you against one another in endless competition, turning workers into rivals, neighbors into strangers, all to ensure that the collective power of the many is never realized. This is the insidious genius of capitalism. It devours not only your time, but your spirit, and convinces you that this devouring is desirable. Comrades, understand this. Your time is the axis on which the future turns. The moment you recognize that every second stolen by the system is a moment you could have spent reclaiming your dignity, your knowledge, your humanity, the chains begin to weaken. For the working class, united in awareness and action, is the sole force capable of overturning this parasitic order. Your labor, when organized, becomes power. Your collective hours, when aligned toward justice, become revolution. Let us not be deceived by the comforts offered to the compliant. A clock may tick, but it does not measure freedom. Your time cannot be bought, rented, or sold without your consent. The true theft is not the loss of wages, it is the surrender of your capacity to choose, to think, to imagine a world not ruled by profit, but by the needs of the many. Every hour spent in subjugation is a victory for those who would keep you passive, atomized, and dependent. But every hour you seize in knowledge, solidarity, and purposeful action is a strike against them. Rise, comrades, and recognize that time is your most valuable weapon. Organize, agitate, educate, and act. Demand that your labor serve life, not the coffers of the few. Build a society in which your time is your own, in which your efforts enrich the collective rather than the elite. Cast off the illusions of competition and scarcity. In unity lies your strength. In consciousness lies your liberation. The system will resist. The ruling class will fight to maintain the extraction of your hours, your vitality, your very self. But know this, the power of the many, moving together with purpose, is unstoppable. History is written not by the idle, but by those who seize their time, their lives, and their destiny. Do not allow another moment to be devoured. Let the workers, the oppressed, the conscious, reclaim the value that is rightfully theirs. For when you take back your time, you take back your life, and the world can finally belong to those who create it. Time is not merely a succession of hours or the ticking of a clock. It is the very substance of human existence. Each second of our lives represents an irreplaceable fragment of our being, a portion of our consciousness, energy, and potential. Yet under the capitalist system, this most precious of commodities is relentlessly devoured, appropriated, and transformed into profit for those who own the means of production, while leaving the producers, the workers, stripped of its value. From the moment one awakens, the mechanisms of capitalism are already at work, channeling our time into labor that serves not the fulfillment of our own needs, but the enrichment of a few who stand above society as its exploiters. Every hour spent under the demands of employment. Every minute given to tasks dictated by another is siphoned away from our capacity to think freely, to imagine new worlds, to cultivate our own potential and relationships. The capitalist system does not see our time as our own. It sees it as raw material, as surplus, to be extracted, quantified, and converted into wealth for those who wield power. This exploitation is not merely incidental, it is systemic. The entire organization of society is structured to ensure that the workers' time is consumed, fragmented, and subordinated to the imperatives of profit. The factory, the office, the digital platform, and even the household, under the logic of market capitalism, become sites of extraction. The laborer is taught to measure existence in terms of wage, productivity, or output rather than in terms of autonomy, fulfillment, or the development of human capacities. Time that could be spent in learning, in creativity, in social bonds, or in contemplation is instead redirected into producing commodities that the worker will not own, service of a system that rewards alienation and punishes independence. Capitalism, in this sense, is not merely an economic structure, it is an architecture of time, a regime that colonizes human life itself, leaving the worker's hours, days, and years as instruments of someone else's power. The system cultivates illusions to make this theft palatable. It presents labor as dignity, as moral virtue, as a natural condition of existence. It tells the worker that surrendering hours to endless tasks, to the treadmill of competition and consumption, is a personal achievement or even a pathway to freedom. Yet every moment thus surrendered strengthens the fortress of exploitation. The ruling class does not simply demand work. It demands obedience to the rhythms of the system, shaping the very structure of daily life, so that time becomes a chain rather than a gift. The clock, which should mark moments of possibility, instead becomes a tool of domination, a reminder of hours sold and lives constrained. In this way, time is not merely taken, it is disciplined, regimented, and rendered into a resource for capital accumulation. Awareness of this reality is both urgent and radical. To recognize the value of one's time is to confront the essence of exploitation itself. It is to see that labor under capitalism is not neutral. It is a form of life surrendered without reciprocal ownership. It is to understand that the relentless demands on the worker's time serve to consolidate inequality, concentrate wealth, and perpetuate the power of the few over the many. The struggle over time is therefore inseparable from the struggle over social justice, human dignity, and collective emancipation. If the worker can reclaim control over the allocation of time, if the collective can resist, the theft of life itself, the very foundations of capitalist power, can be shaken. Time, when viewed as a weapon rather than a commodity, becomes the terrain of revolution. Every hour consciously redirected toward learning, organizing, building solidarity, or creating collectively is a strike against the appropriation of human life. Every refusal to surrender one's hours to meaningless toil or to the dictates of profit is an assertion of self-determination. The power to organize time collectively, to structure life around the needs of the people, rather than the profits of capital, is the cornerstone of social transformation. In this light, the laborer is not merely a producer of commodities, but a custodian of time, a bearer of the potential for liberation, whose conscious recognition of the value of life itself is the first step toward dismantling the structures that seek to devour it. The labor of the worker is the source of all wealth in society, yet under capitalism it is never fully the worker's own. Every product of toil, every idea transformed into commodity, every act of creativity, skill, and effort becomes the property not of the producer, but of those who control the instruments of production. The worker pours time, energy, and intellect into creating value, yet the fruits of this labor are expropriated, accumulated, and concentrated in the hands of the ruling class, who sit safely removed from the struggle and sweat of the everyday. The capitalist receives the rewards of effort without participating in its exertion, living off the surplus produced by them. Many, while the producer remains dependent, often impoverished, and alienated from the very work that sustains society. This is not mere injustice. It is the fundamental mechanism of exploitation, a system so ingrained and normalized that it masquerades as the natural order of things. The capitalist claims ownership not because of personal merit or creativity, but because of control over the tools, factories, land, or networks through which labor is mediated. The worker may spin the thread, shape the steel, write the code, or deliver the service, but the product belongs to the employer. It is through this structural expropriation that capital grows, for the value produced by the worker exceeds the value they receive in wages. This difference, the surplus value, is seized by the ruling class, who convert the efforts of millions into wealth, power, and influence. Thus, the worker is caught in a perpetual cycle, producing more than they receive, consumed by labor, and yet rendered dependent on the very system that exploits them. The process is not accidental. It is the lifeblood of capitalism. Without the theft of surplus labor, the system would collapse. Moreover, this expropriation is not merely economic, it is social and psychological. The worker is alienated from the product of their own hands, seeing it transformed into a commodity they cannot control. This alienation extends beyond objects to the worker's own sense of self, for labor under capitalism becomes a means of survival rather than an expression of creativity or purpose. Every act of production is subordinated to the interests of those who claim the profits and the worker. Life is reduced to a commodity, a unit of labor to be exchanged, measured, and exploited. Meanwhile, the ruling class enjoys the material and social fruits of this labor without toil, consolidating cultural, political, and economic dominance that allows them to dictate the terms of society and reproduce exploitation indefinitely. The mechanisms of theft are reinforced through ideology, law, and culture. Wages are presented as fair compensation, private property is inviolable, and hierarchy is necessary. Schools, media, and religion instruct the worker to accept this arrangement as natural, to believe that their efforts and sacrifices are virtuous, even as they are systematically stripped of what they produce. They are encouraged to compete, to envy, to seek personal advancement within the confines of the system rather than question the system itself. This ideological domination ensures that the expropriation of labor remains largely invisible, that the theft of wealth appears as consent rather than coercion. Yet, when we pierce the veil, the truth becomes undeniable. The worker's labor is the engine of wealth, and the ruling class thrives only through its systematic theft. Every skyscraper, every machine, every commodity, every service in society owes its existence to labor, yet the laborer sees only a fraction of the value returned. This is why awareness and organization are revolutionary acts. When workers recognize the reality of expropriation, when they understand that the wealth they create belongs to them collectively rather than to the privileged few, the possibility of transformation arises. The expropriation of labor is not eternal law. It is a social arrangement maintained by the structures of power and the division of society. By uniting and reclaiming control over production and its outcomes, the working class has the power to dismantle this theft, to redirect wealth toward the common good, and to redefine the purpose of labor as life-affirming rather than exploitative. Expropriation, however, is not limited to material goods. It extends to the worker's sense of freedom, creativity, and time. Make the theft of wealth inseparable from the theft of life itself, understanding that labor produces real value, and that this value is being appropriated without justice, is the spark that ignites class consciousness. It is the recognition that exploitation is systemic, not accidental, and that only through collective struggle can it be ended. Workers, when they see themselves as the rightful creators of wealth, gain the moral and practical authority to challenge, resist, and ultimately overturn the structures that have profited from their toil for centuries. The capitalist system survives not merely through the extraction of labor or the accumulation of wealth, but through the deliberate and systematic division of those whose labor sustains it. Workers, who collectively produce all value in society, are rendered powerless when they are pitted against one another, when solidarity is replaced by competition, suspicion, and fear. The ruling class understands this truth better than any doctrine of justice or morality. A divided working class cannot challenge the structures that exploit it. They wield ideology, culture, and institutions not only to extract surplus labor, but to ensure that those who labor are kept separate, isolated, and disoriented. By teaching workers to see one another as rivals rather than comrades, the system transforms potential power into fragmentation. Neighbor opposes neighbor, employee opposes employee, citizen opposes citizen. And in this division, the mechanisms of control function effortlessly. Capitalism thrives on this disunity because collective strength is the only true threat to the status quo. When workers fail to recognize their common condition, when they accept hierarchy, wage, inequality, and competition as natural, they internalize the logic of exploitation. The worker's struggle is individualized. The laborer fights for personal advancement rather than shared liberation. The system benefits from this because individual victories are temporary, isolated, and insufficient to disrupt the broader machinery of extraction. Meanwhile, those at the top consolidate wealth and influence, using the divisions among the many to fortify their dominance. The tactics are subtle yet powerful: cultural narratives that valorize personal ambition, legal structures that protect private property and profit, social hierarchies that reward loyalty to the system rather than collective consciousness. Every division, every rivalry, every instance of workers turning against one another is another brick in the fortress of capitalist power. Yet, this division is not natural, it is manufactured. Workers are not inherently competitors or enemies, they are taught to be. From early education to media, from corporate training to social norms, individuals are conditioned to accept scarcity, to envy the successes of others, and to see self-interest as paramount. The system relies on the false promise that personal gain can be achieved within its oppressive framework, all the while denying that true power lies in collective action. The very conditions of exploitation, long hours, economic precarity, the stress of survival, serve to fragment consciousness, making cooperation appear difficult or impossible. By the time workers become aware of the mechanisms of control they have, internalize the divisions necessary to sustain their subjugation. But unity among workers is revolutionary. When the working class recognizes that their fates are interconnected, that the success of one is inseparable from the success of all, the dynamics of power shift. Solidarity transforms mere labor into political force, fragmented resistance into organized struggle, collective action the coordinated assertion of rights, the refusal to accept exploitation, the strategic occupation of production and public spaces becomes a tool capable of dismantling systemic oppression. History demonstrates this truth. The most significant social transformations have arisen when workers set aside manufactured rivalries and confront the mechanisms of exploitation as a united force. Unity amplifies strength, clarity, and agency, making the illusions of scarcity, competition, and hierarchy meaningless in the face of organized collective power. Unity is not merely a moral imperative, it is a strategic necessity. The capitalist system relies upon the atomization of the working class to perpetuate inequality, and its institutions, law, media, education, and culture function to reinforce this isolation. Every effort to sow division among workers is an effort to maintain control over the surplus labor they produce. Therefore, revolutionary consciousness begins with understanding the ways in which separation serves the interests of the few, recognizing common interests, shared exploitation, and collective potential is the first step toward overthrowing the structures that profit from division. The worker, when conscious of this reality, becomes both vigilant and empowered, seeing that liberation is inseparable from solidarity, and that time, energy, and effort spent in unity cannot be co-opted by the ruling class. The challenge, then, is to transform awareness into organization and organization into action. Solidarity must extend beyond immediate workplaces, neighborhoods, or industry to encompass the full spectrum of the exploited and oppressed. It requires a shared vision, mutual support, and the willingness to resist the tactics designed to divide and weaken. When workers unite, they reclaim the power that has been denied to them, turning what was once a source of exploitation into a force for justice, equity, and social transformation. In the face of such unity, the mechanisms that have maintained capitalist dominance, competition, hierarchy, alienation, and division become vulnerable, exposed as instruments of control rather than inevitabilities of human society. Unity is revolutionary because it transforms the very conditions of oppression into the conditions for liberation, giving the working class the collective power to not merely survive, but to reshape society according to its own needs and values. Conscious awareness of exploitation is not a mere intellectual exercise. It is the spark that ignites the possibility of liberation. Under capitalism, the worker is conditioned to accept subjugation as natural, to see inequality, hierarchy, and deprivation as inevitable, and to confuse survival within the system with freedom. The laborer is trained to measure success by wages, status, or consumption, while the true cost of survival, the surrender of time, energy, and creativity, is rendered invisible. Exploitation under capitalism is not always overt. It operates through subtle mechanisms, shaping thought, perception, and desire, so that the worker participates willingly in their own subordination. The first step toward reclaiming life is to pierce this veil of illusion, to recognize that what has been accepted as normal is, in reality, systemic theft of labor, time, and dignity. To be conscious of exploitation is to see clearly the structures that govern society, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the extraction of surplus value from the labor of the many, and the ideological frameworks that justify these inequalities. It is to understand that labor does not naturally belong to the employer, that the fruits of one's own effort are not inherently property of the ruling class, and that what has been taken by force or by consent, manufactured through social conditioning, can, in principle, be reclaimed. Awareness exposes the lie that the individual worker's fate is separate from that of their class. It reveals the truth that alienation from the product of labor, from the process of labor, from fellow workers, and from one's own human potential is systemic, not personal, and that it has been designed to maintain control over the working majority. This consciousness is a revolutionary act because it transforms passive suffering into understanding, and understanding into the potential for action. Once the worker sees the mechanisms of exploitation for what they are, the abstract forces of capital become concrete targets for resistance. The oppression that once seemed natural becomes a challenge that can be confronted. Labor is no longer simply endured. It is analyzed, measured, and critiqued. The worker comes to understand that every hour spent producing value for another is a moment that could be redirected toward self-determination, toward solidarity, and toward the creation of a society that serves the many rather than the few. Awareness awakens the moral and intellectual faculties necessary to envision an alternative world. Moreover, conscious recognition of exploitation extends beyond personal insight. It has a social dimension. Understanding that one is exploited is incomplete without recognizing that millions share the same condition. This collective awareness forms the basis of solidarity, the understanding that individual liberation is inseparable from the liberation of the class. Workers who see themselves as part of a broader social struggle begin to question not only the structure of production but the political, cultural, and economic institutions that sustain inequality. They begin to challenge the narratives that legitimize hierarchy, the ideologies that normalize alienation, and the laws that protect private accumulation over human welfare. Consciousness, in this sense, is both illumination and weapon. It exposes the theft of life and arms the worker with the knowledge required to resist. The first step toward reclaiming life is therefore inseparable from education, reflection, and dialogue among workers. It involves examining the material conditions of existence, the history of exploitation, and the tactics by which power is maintained. It demands rejecting the false promises of meritocracy, individual advancement within the system, and the illusion that incremental gains are sufficient to restore what has been lost. True awareness is both analytical and emotional. It combines the intellectual recognition of systemic theft with the moral indignation that arises from understanding one's own alienation and the suffering of one's class. In this dual recognition, the seed of transformation is planted, for a worker who sees exploitation cannot remain complacent, and a class that sees its condition collectively cannot remain divided. Once the worker achieves consciousness of exploitation, life itself becomes reclaimable. Time, labor, creativity, and thought once surrendered unconsciously to the imperatives of capital can be directed toward liberation, solidarity, and the construction of a society where the purpose of labor is the fulfillment of human needs rather than the enrichment of the few. Awareness transforms alienation into agency, passivity into resistance, and resignation into action. The moment of recognition is also the moment of possibility, the first step in a broader journey toward reclaiming not merely wages or rights, but the very substance of existence that capitalism has sought to consume. The reclamation of time, labor, and freedom cannot occur through isolated effort, individual protest, or passive hope. It demands collective action and organization. Capitalism is not merely an economic system, but a social apparatus meticulously designed to fragment the working class, to scatter its strength, and to channel its energies into the perpetuation of exploitation. The mechanisms of extraction, alienation, and oppression are systemic, and they are maintained by the division of the people whose labor creates all wealth. The ruling class thrives because workers are atomized, competing against one another, distracted by individual advancement or consumed by survival. Only when workers recognize the necessity of joining their struggles, aligning their efforts, and coordinating their actions does the potential for liberation emerge. Collective organization transforms individual labor into social power, turning fragmented toil into a revolutionary force capable of challenging the structures that exploit it. Organization is the vehicle through which consciousness becomes action. Awareness of exploitation, alienation, and inequality, while essential, is insufficient when left unchanneled. Without a framework for solidarity, shared strategy, and coordinated effort, understanding remains abstract, and the worker's potential is dispersed and ineffective. It is in the act of organizing that theory meets practice, and consciousness becomes tangible power. Workers who unite to negotiate, resist, and reclaim control over the conditions of labor are no longer passive participants in a system designed to consume them. They become agents of social transformation. This organization can take many forms: unions, cooperatives, councils, strikes, political movements, and communal networks. The form is less important than the principle: the collective assertion of rights, the shared defense of labor, and the strategic alignment of human energy against exploitation. Time under capitalism is treated as a commodity to be bought, sold, and stolen, yet in organized action it becomes a resource of power. When workers coordinate their labor, time is no longer surrendered unconsciously but directed toward shared objectives, whether these involve demanding fair wages, improving working conditions, or challenging the very structures that enforce inequality. Labor, too, is reclaimed through organization. The collective assertion of rights over production and the outcomes of labor transforms work from an instrument of alienation into a tool of emancipation. It is no longer merely a means for the accumulation of wealth for the few, but a mechanism through which society can prioritize human needs, creativity, and freedom. Freedom itself, both as the right to self-determination and as the capacity to shape one's life, is inseparable from collective power. For the structures that constrain individuals are systemic, and systemic constraints require systemic opposition. History demonstrates that the emancipation of labor has never been granted voluntarily by the ruling class. Concessions, reforms, and temporary reliefs occur only in response to organized pressure and coordinated struggle. Without collective action, individual demands are easily absorbed, neutralized, or ignored. But when workers act in unison, their power is amplified exponentially, and the previously unquestioned authority of the elite becomes vulnerable. Strikes halt production, boycotts disrupt markets, protests demand public attention, and councils challenge decision-making structures. The very act of organizing communicates to the system that labor cannot be treated as mere commodity, that time is not for sale without consent, and that freedom cannot be constrained indefinitely. Organization is the practical manifestation of class consciousness. It turned the recognition of exploitation into a concrete strategy for liberation. Collective action also cultivates solidarity, mutual understanding, and shared responsibility. In organization, workers learn that individual struggles are inseparable from collective conditions, and that the liberation of one is bound to the liberation of all. This understanding erodes the divisions deliberately sown by capitalism: competition, suspicion, envy, and alienation and replaces them with collaboration, trust, and shared purpose. When workers recognize that their strength lies in unity and when they commit to coordinated, strategic action, the system's foundations are shaken. No longer can capital rely on atomization and isolation to perpetuate extraction. Collective labor becomes both shield and sword in the struggle for justice. Thus, the reclamation of time, labor, and freedom is inseparable from the principle of organization. Knowledge without coordination, awareness without action, and labor without solidarity are insufficient to overturn the structures of exploitation. But when workers unite, align their efforts, and act with strategic consciousness, they not only defend their rights, but transform the very conditions of life. Organization allows labor to serve life rather than profit, time to serve the people rather than capital, and freedom to be realized as the capacity to shape society in accordance with human needs, creativity, and dignity. In this collective movement, the exploited discover their true strength, and the mechanisms of oppression are exposed as neither eternal nor invincible. Comrades, the threads of our struggle are clear. Time, labor, awareness, unity, and collective action are the very foundations upon which liberation must be built. The system seeks to devour our lives, to extract every ounce of our effort, and to divide us so that we cannot recognize our own power. Yet we have seen the truth. Our time is invaluable. Our labor is the source of wealth. Our awareness can pierce the illusions of oppression, and our unity transforms scattered strength into unstoppable force. To reclaim what has been stolen, our hours, our energy, our dignity, we must act together, organized, conscious, and resolute. History is shaped not by those who submit to exploitation, but by those who seize their lives and destinies with collective determination. Let the working class rise, let solidarity bind us, and let action be the measure of our freedom. For only in the hands of the many can the world finally be remade to serve life rather than profit.